Hello, this is Jim McGill. This is advice for the Not-Pocalypse, number 7. At the end of this podcast, I'm including some found music. I found it in Ann Morrison Park a few evenings ago. That's in Boise, City of Trees. It's all part of the service I consider to be pro bono. That's Latin for the public good. Bono of U2 started out as bono vox. That's Latin for good voice. Latin phrase vox populi, vox Dei means the voice of the people, implied is the voice of God. There's a Vox Populi gallery in Philadelphia. Vox.com is a reliable news source I check weekly. Possibly it's related to Vox magazine. Now here's an interesting coincidence. Bono Vox of U2, when he was a small child named Paul, witnessed a bindlestiff and hobo in an argument at a newsstand that turned violent. The bindlestiff grabbed a bundle of Vox magazines and beat the hobo to death. You know I made that up, right? Here's why you know. Paul David Hewson, aka Bono, was born in 1960, but the bindlestiffs and hobos merged as a result of the Treaty of Okie City in 1930 and result of the 1929 market crash. Both bindlestiff and hobo tribes have always behaved honorably, even during their frequent skirmishes after our Civil War. Add to this the well-documented fact that it would have been much more likely that the traditionally surly hobo would have beaten the habitually gentle bindlestiff to death, and you've applied your critical thinking skills. As long as you have the correct facts to begin with, it's not that difficult to separate truth from lies. There's more detail in my previous podcast in this series, but I'm putting in a plug for the science paper and project channel my son Finn is curating for me. Before it gets too serious, how about a music break? Good evening. I'm Jim. This is Alan. I got him in Kenya in 1982. Jambo. Anyway, I don't know his name yet. This is Chopin. Will be. Prelude in E minor, opus 28, number 4. I'm concerned with the fact that too much of the stable social order is coming unglued because humans are acting from fear more so than from the prevailing conditions themselves. One of my primary goals is to help you replace your fear with 3 interrelated attitudes. Instead of fear, Wouldn't you rather operate from a place of empowerment by blending rational, fact-based thinking with love? This is an ethical way to live in normal times. It's more important in a family or tribal crisis. The basis of ethics and morality are expressions and actions that lead to the most survivable outcome at the personal, tribal, and national levels. I believe all three, finding power in acting deliberately and loving your neighbor, are crucial to the best possible outcome during this wide-ranging health, economic, and social meltdown. Collaboration with your neighbors in finding and maintaining community that didn't exist before is key. Or should we all just stick with fear? I assumed it was fear that led my boss lady's boss lady to ask me to quit playing the news on the radio that it seemed coworkers were starting to pay attention to. I asked if somebody had complained and if turning it way down was okay. No, this is from me, she said. One earbud, she reminded me, since we're allowed to listen to anything we want on smartphones. She didn't want people being unnecessarily scared. That's her word. Here's why that seemed very wrong. In the early 1980s, I was on a Pacific cruise on the USS Enterprise. I told you I'm an alien. I was working on sub-Hunter aircraft, electronics. Yuri Andropov was the new General Secretary of the USSR. Ronald Reagan was in his first term and must have been feeling froggy. You see, there's a number of ships associated with and steaming in the general area of an aircraft carrier. I'm unclear why it seemed a good idea to point three whole carrier groups, Enterprise and, I believe, Constellation and Coral Sea, towards the port of Vladivostok. That would be equivalent to maybe 100 Soviet ships suddenly changing course, heading towards San Francisco Bay. What would U.S. do? The Soviets reacted with reasonable caution, of course. Like Sting was singing about then, we hope the Russians love their children too. They sent out aircraft to keep track of the impending threat. The closer we came, the more aircraft they sent, flying closer to the carriers. Of course, every incoming warplane has to be countered. We'd sortie EA-6Bs and other smart birds, which collected electronic intelligence about what we were up against. F-14s patrolled, ready to shoot down or, if required, crash into any threat if it seemed ready to spark off a missile or opened bomb bay doors. Over several days and nights, there wasn't much sleep. We launched, turned around, and recovered what seemed like a record number of aircraft. For a time, every aircraft that could fly, whatever couldn't were called hangar queens, was off the deck to make the carrier a less inviting target. One late night, for about an hour, the entire crew started hearing, via the 1MC, the intercom, real-time announcements about a MiG-21 Bison, if I remember. According to the EA-6B's electronic intercepts, it had an armed nuclear weapon aboard and was making a beeline for Enterprise. As I recall, that answer to our impending moves was enough. Ships all turned away from Vladivostok, started minding our own beeswax again. But here's the point. While 6,000 sailors on my ship could have been peeing themselves, we mostly weren't. It seemed to the powers that be that more information is better, not less. It's hard for me to picture circumstances in which knowing fewer facts is better than knowing too many. That's been a guiding principle for me most of my life. Naturally, it's important to discriminate whether the information you're getting is factual or fiction. This week, I walked away from that job days after I qualified for my first annual review and probably a healthy pay raise. That meeting had been put off due to the crisis and management concerns. Although I am the virus whisperer who volunteered when corporates needed someone to clean and Lysol doorknobs and work surfaces, I had been increasingly concerned about my own health. I was the sole person trying to social distance. There were daily meetings of 2, 3, or 4 people in a small office. Everybody huddled together, ate next to each other, talked in each other's faces. I was the only person with the fashionable bandana covering my face while passing closely. Late last week, I asked Boss Lady if she thought I was overreacting. Her reaction was sarcastic. I'm certain that if anybody has COVID-19 there, everybody does. I quit for my physical health, but that wasn't the deciding factor. There were other stresses that were triggered by this economic crisis. For reasons I've just begun to grasp, I have a theory. Management's policy feared the news more than the infection. I've been hearing stories of these science-challenged faith leaders who don't know the difference between a medical quarantine and a political one. Some seem to think this crisis is fake, has been cooked up to mess with the economy, or maybe force societal change. Some believe they will be supernaturally protected, or that they have access to divine healing. I hear these news stories, then I started applying what I know and tidbits I had heard from managers at work. I don't mean to embarrass anybody, but I heard accurate news described as fake. I know Boss Lady's church believes in miraculous healing, though I never witnessed it when I attended. I believe, but don't know, that Boss Lady's boss shares some of Boss Lady's mystical belief system. 2-ish weeks ago, I asked if her church was meeting via video yet. She said they have to follow the law, even if it's stupid. See where I'm going with this? I may be wrong, but it feels like I left an environmentally unsafe job because management didn't believe there's a genuine health crisis. Maybe I'll collect unemployment with millions of others, or hopefully find a way to avoid it. I could deliver pizzas. That job that I just left had been lately getting weird for me, contributing to 10 pounds weight loss in 5 weeks. I took control of that. But I'm not mad at anybody, just disappointed. They are acting according to their own fearful human natures and limitations. It's my fault that my expectations were too high based on my assumptions of expected behavior, given their stated allegiances. I hope the company continues to succeed and that this crisis doesn't break what they still have that's good and profitable. I'll probably discuss the results of a behavior experiment I did there in a podcast series called Auto-Necropsy of a Well-Being coming up. It's about me personally and my outsider's POV, an abbreviation for point of view that's an even trade of syllables. It seemed hip to say POV, but I don't even know if something being hip is still hip. The hippocampus is part of the limbic system and plays important roles in the consolidation of information from short-term memory to long-term memory and in spatial memory that enables navigation. The theory that hip actually refers to this system, the idea being if a situation in mind can make the comfortable transition from short-term to long-term memory, thus it's hip, you see, has one major flaw, being that I made that up. There's one difference between a liar and a storyteller. How does the tale end? My green and human network of good was always meant to be a resume of my skills. Freedom to be available to do useful things for projects I can get behind and do so as much for the knowledge as some pay. I live frugal. I don't have to charge much. So now I'm available. You probably have a good idea of what I can do. Question is, what can I do for you? My newly ex-employer was into water conservation, which is cool. But after being there long enough to see how brilliantly they can save a farmer or others on their water bills with just enough water needed to grow crops or grass, I started wondering about the bigger picture. Where there's rain, there's a lot more comes down than is required by the growth on the surface. Shouldn't there be excess to feed water tables? I followed up on a hunch, found out that below surface water levels are being depleted where these conservation measures and widespread agriculture converge. So that's off my conscience now too. I own three air-cooled VWs. I bought a red 71 bus from a good Unitarian that I owned the longest. Also a 68 Super Beetle and a 67 split window bus I rolled about 6 weeks after I bought it. They were the peak of World War II German technology, well engineered but uncomplicated. A handy person with a toolbox and the commonly required spare parts might make substantial repairs by the side of the road. Air-cooled means no liquid coolant, as modern cars have. The cooling system was circulating engine oil and fans built into the aluminum frame. When I'd set out for a midsummer excursion, temps 90 or 100 and above, I felt I was stress testing the vehicle. German engineering foresaw that 20 years later I'd need a reliable vehicle for $1,600. It broke down a few times, never from overheating. Many thousands of citizens and subjects over the world have either camped or lived in the meager but adequate conditions of a VW bus or camper. Part of the draw to a simple life is the concept that luxuries can get in the way of living authentically. How much time and energy will an American invest making money to pay for time and energy-saving gadgets? When we do manage to come out ahead on that trade, it's not necessarily bad if we spend the time saved in front of screens. I try not to judge families that can spend 20 plus hours a week in front of a TV and haven't seen a documentary or educational programming for months. Since time is the single valuable item we have, if someone chooses to spend the excess being entertained, it's not my business, as long as everybody pulls their weight and pays their own bills. As I pointed out earlier in this series, however, it might be conducive to longer-term survival if people learned how to do many more things that need doing for people to live. We are living through what can easily become a social and economic upheaval, not a minor glitch. Regarding camping or retired nomads, there's nicer or at least different options to a bus or van. There's campers on pickups, trailers like apartments on wheels, converted school buses, well-appointed motorcycles with camping gear, recreational vehicles of various sizes and amenities, and luxury apartments built into 18-wheelers. This is an obvious metaphor for the U.S. economy and society. If you also add people who carry their possessions in backpacks, maybe they have a bike, and those who live in their cars and know where the shelters are, that's us in our normal state, for good or ill. Our society and economy, and frankly the educational level of our citizens, are beginning a severe stress test. Governments are printing money, and that will be flowing soon. Think of all those vehicles having access to cheap petrol. But if there's a breakdown, your initial options depend on your standard of living. Many live frugal and clever. If the bus breaks down, they can likely fix it. If the stove in the pickup camper quits, the cowboy driving it can at least generate a fire to cook for his dependents. When the fridge freezer in the RV quits, the retired couple know to eat the steak first, at least. What happens when the truck stops and grocery stores can't open? If a motorhome blows a rod and mechanics are homesick or home trying to stay well, and anyway the only tow truck operator in this county is trying to learn hydroponics in his barn, afraid to leave the homestead. See where I'm going with this? My fellow citizens and I are learning enough humility to need each other again. This is an improvement. It's not in my nature to ignore strangers. I'm always waving at people I drive slowly by in the neighborhood, speaking to humans in grocery store aisles. Now they wave back, speak back, appreciate the fact there's humans around them facing similar problems. The luxury 18-wheel dweller is going to have to learn skills from the camper cowboy and the aging hippies in the van. If too many interconnected complex systems fail, they'll all be wishing they knew what the backpack family had to learn a long time ago. The word epidemic, epi, among or upon, plus demos, people, or district. The original epidemie was an old French word, and the among and upon people and districts they were talking about was bubonic plague. By contrast, the same disease, an epidemic, that's no longer limited to certain districts, has moved everywhere, is a pandemic. Pan is the Greek god of nature and fertility, essentially the god of all the physical world. He's sort of human above, but mutton below, and, rumor had it, Pan is very well endowed. Kids, that means he acquired a huge financial grant about the time of his bar mitzvah. Pandemonium was the name of the palace at the center of hell in John Milton's 1667 classic Paradise Lost. Many English words start as a simile or a metaphor. If your job is so tedious it reminds you of drilling a hole without electricity, it's boring. A hopefully well-marked boundary around a prison camp where, if you cross it, you can be shot, that's the deadline. If your house is worth less than you owe, you're underwater. If you can logically and quickly arrive at the right conclusions from lots of data, some of which is irrelevant, you're sharp. You might have an acute, geometry term implying sharp, sense of humor. If not, maybe you're just dull. Google was a company with a search engine. Now it's a verb. Facebook wasn't a word either. Now it's a noun and verb. Like many words in English, Hell's Palace, pandemonium, became a simile or metaphor, then became a word that means a place of uproar and disorder in the late 1700s, broadened to wild, lawless confusion in the 1860s. Panacea is a universal remedy. In Latin, various herbs were called panacea when they were believed to cure everything. Greek panacea was the all-cure. A mime is a mimic actor, but earlier a mime was a buffoon who gesticulated a lot. A Greek mimic actor, literally an imitator of all, is a pantomimos, from which we get pantomime. Pangea is the hypothetical name for the single land mass that split up into continents. And, of course, pan is bread in Spanish, and a bread product fried in a pan is a pancake. Probably no etymological relationships. So, a pandemic is an epidemic everywhere. The last pandemic was called Spanish influenza, though it didn't start in Spain, first noticed in 1918. 2020 is better for us biologically than 1918, when very few doctors knew what a virus was. The first virus was discovered by someone trying to figure out what was destroying tobacco plants in the 1890s. Florence Nightingale hadn't demonstrated to the world yet that cleanliness is healthy and that clinical sterility is useful in a clinic. A lot of pharmaceuticals and mechanical technologies have developed since 1918. Bear in mind, when someone is bad enough off to need a ventilator to breathe, under normal conditions, there's around a 50% mortality rate. When many people need ventilators, they represent the very sickest of lots more sick people. There were no ventilators or respirators or oxygen tents in 1918, so we are much better off, right? Absolutely. If you're in a first world country and have access to good health care, how many more Americans would have no health insurance if this pandemic had happened 11 years ago before Obamacare? I heard the feds will cover expenses related to this pandemic. Perhaps, but if it's in the public's interest for everybody to be healthy in an emergency, why not always? As I've written or said before, more people go bankrupt due to health-related bills or inability to work than for any other reason. That doesn't seem ethical to me. Doesn't U.S. embrace morality? Other 21st century nations like Taiwan and South Korea have more comprehensive systems in place already to ensure all their people are healthy. Consequently, they're already testing vastly higher percentages, isolating infections, getting ready to put people back to work with data showing where and when that will be safe. Here's a pertinent fact about aircraft design. A one-engine airplane breaks down a lot less than a two-engine. It's not so much there's twice as many mechanical items as it is that in order to make everything work well together, you have to make the entire system much more complicated. So you design in backup systems, which, given human engineering customs, become integral to the whole, which further represents opportunities for breakdowns, fewer of which are fatal, one hopes, but which require new tools and technologies not available to a farmer who just wants to dust his corn. In the economic sense, 2020 could become way worse than 1918. 1918 was a 1971 VW Combi, whereas 2020 is, of course, the newest, most technologically adapted luxury motorhome. If the VW starts leaking oil, it can't leak coolant. I might figure it out and fix it, or find a way to limp to almost any backyard mechanic, be back on the road in an hour or in a couple of days if I have to hitch a ride to the junkyard first. Yes, I've done that. If the modern rig starts leaking fluids or the space-age indicators on the dash start playing Donkey Kong and it'll crank but not start, the only advanced facility able to diagnose and repair that RV might be 3 counties away. In 1918, there was no air travel. The novel coronavirus took Pan-American, Pan-African, Pan-Asia, and Lufthansa flights everywhere before it was hardly detected. In 2020, our entire socio-economic system is way more intricate. It depends on exotic supply chains and consistent electricity. In 1918, if the food wagon didn't reach town, people still knew how to grow their own veggies and slaughter a hog, and they could easily lay hands on the tools and animals to do it. 2020's agricultural system depends on tech as much as any industry. Again, I'd like to remind you to have a little perspective. We have access to a healthcare system that's becoming overburdened. There's people around the world who have healthcare with even higher standards than America's. There's many more people with none at all. To many humans we share this planet with, COVID-19 is just another disease that's sweeping through, killing friends and relatives like other diseases have before. Life, such as it is, will get back to what seems normal to them and might look like hell to you. I know a little about that. I've been outside. If people and nations don't act in concert, cooperatively, respectfully, and with compassion, this pandemic and the accompanying economic crisis can easily spiral. Current U.S. supply chains for pharmaceutical ingredients are mostly from China. The president of Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, 3M, had to tell the feds it would be unwise to withhold face masks from export. As I wrote before, it could take 18 months or longer to find an effective vaccine. In that time, the disease could sweep around the globe 3 times, shifting antigens each time, forcing regional economies into coma. While deep in the throes, regions will need aid from outside. When that outbreak passes and sufficient testing allows the economy to wake back up at some reduced level, those workers will need to be producing goods or growing food for the next affected regions. This is, in my judgment, the best and most likely future. Without rational multinational cooperation, including caring for third world people in a way that the first world hasn't bothered with up until now, viri don't actually have nationalities, and infected refugees cross borders too, will have what I think of as the worst, most likely future. When nations need resources they don't have and can't trade for them, war happens. One positive of a war against a pandemic is that, except for scientifically backward collaborators, most of the humans can be on the winning side. Ensuring public health for the entire human population, in this case, is also necessary for keeping the peace. If the power's out, there's not a lot a modern hospital can do for you that you wouldn't get in Argentina in the best of times, where fewer than half the hospitals ever had indoor plumbing. Before a vaccine, there will be new antivirals. In a few months, if they work but are in short supply, if your ration card was stamped already because the kids had colds 2 weeks ago, if the Salvation Army bread line closed again because they all got sick or lost faith, if the only thing you ever knew how to do was put left-handed lug nuts on Chryslers and the plant's been closed for a year now, it might feel like 1918 to you. My next topic, in number 8, will be on human empathy and related subjects. I will be controversial because it seems to me much work needs to be done upgrading ignorant attitudes and dropping unverified assumptions. We need to start loving our neighbors, imperfect as they know we are. I'll start with a question my governor, Brad Little, was asked a couple weeks ago. He's a bright guy, probably knows the answer, but he had trouble answering. I know why.
You've brought a tear to my eye, you have.
Sorry about that.
No, I love it. I'm recording it. Have a good evening.